So, this is now my honor to introduce Dr. Kissinger. As I'm sure you're all aware, he's had a long and extraordinary life. When I say extraordinary, I don't just mean he won the Nobel Prize, that he won the National Book Award, that he won the Presidential Medal of Freedom. You have to think about his life in this context. Think about this timeline, and then step back and you'll see why I say it's extraordinary. Dr. Kissinger came to America in 1938 at age 15 with his family as German refugees only 3 months before Kristallnacht. As fate would have it, just 5 years later, he's now 20, he made a return trip to Nazi Germany, this time under the auspices of the US Army. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge and stayed on as an advisor, rising in rank because of his knowledge of German, as you might expect. This was rather helpful as they tried to ferret out lots of Nazis. And Dr. Kissinger actually took responsibility for reorganizing lots of towns, small cities in Nazi Germany. He was 20 then. After being released by the Army in 1950, Dr. Kissinger attended Harvard University, where he completed his graduate degrees, culminating with a PhD and becoming a tenured professor at Harvard. 20 years later, after coming back from the Army, he was appointed President Nixon's National Security Advisor. 3.5 years later, he was named the 56th Secretary of State, the first Jewish Secretary of State, with his mother, Paula, holding the Bible. Only in America could a 15-year-old immigrant, Jewish to boot, come with no money, no connections, no knowledge of the English language, and go on to serve the United States at the highest levels of government. It's true testimony to what a great country it is, and a true testimony to Dr. Kissinger's extraordinary talents, which served our country really well. This afternoon, we're fortunate to have him talk about a subject where he brings new meaning to the idea of in-depth understanding. What are his experiences in seeing great leaders, great statesmen, under incredible stress? What were they like? What were their qualities? We'll discuss the Yom Kippur War, 1973, because it's the perfect test case. 3 great leaders, Golda Meir, Anwar Sadat, and Richard Nixon. So let's begin, Henry, with one of Israel's most famous and beloved leaders, Prime Minister Golda Meir, elected Prime Minister in 1969, affectionately known as Golda. Her reputation was as a tough lady with a domineering streak. Most Americans didn't know that much about her, but that was her. Ben-Gurion called her the best man in the government. So Henry, my question is, you built this unique relationship with Golda during the Yom Kippur War, and I'd like you to reflect on her leadership capabilities. First, Israelis in general were known for very difficult negotiating styles. But Golda was especially difficult, especially as it related to when meant returning land to Egypt. So my question is, what was it like dealing with her? What did you learn about her character and her vision in that intense period?
Let me say two things before I answer this question. The first is, I'm here because Raja asked me. And Raja has been a mentor and an inspiration for all the decades I've been here in New York. Second, I want to congratulate this organization for giving an award, the Herzl Award, to Norman Podhoretz. Nobody has tormented me more from so many directions than Norman through many years of my public life. But nobody has been a better friend, and more importantly, nobody I respect more, whether we agree on everything or not, and for his courage, for his inspiration, for what he has done for the American and the Jewish people. So,
do you want to say anything about Norman's humility?
So let me answer the question about Golda. When I entered public life, I had this sympathy for the position of Israel, but I was not involved in policies that affected the survival of Israel, though with my background, it was on my mind, of course. So let me say two things about Golda. One, I loved Golda. She reminded me of my Aunt Bertha, who she looked a little bit even like her. And she could drive you crazy if you were engaged in negotiations with her. But it is important to understand how these two elements could coexist. The negotiations in which I was involved and which she led on the Israeli side involved directly the survival of Israel because they occurred at the end of a war of aggression, and because their conduct and outcome might have a major impact, a decisive impact, on the future of the state. The conventional wisdom was that Israel should return to the 47 borders, and that this would be the basis. I believed in a minority that this outcome at that time, and maybe at any time, would jeopardize the survival of the state. So I was convinced that an alternative solution had to be presented as the outcome for a global diplomatic effort that would take place in any event. And therefore, I favored and partly originated the step-by-step approach so that the parties could get used to what was possible and to see what else developed over a period of time. Golda agreed with the principle, but she could not, given her history and her character, agree with the execution, because the essence of the negotiations was that Israel would have to adjust some of its territorial positions in return for gaining the confidence and the assurances of the international community, the vast majority of which was not sympathetic, and the only reliable ally was the United States. So we had parallel objectives, but different emotions. My emotion was to maintain a diplomatic framework which could be continued over a substantial period of time, and out of which support for the survival of Israel could be distilled if one of the parties in these negotiations on the other side kicked over the traces. Golda, who had built the country and who had seen endless suffering and betrayals, found it extremely painful to give up any square inch of territory that had been achieved with so much pain. Now, at that time of these negotiations, they were all on territory that had not been part of Israel itself. We're talking about the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. And I don't know how records are kept, but they should show that I began every conversation with Golda by saying, don't make it too easy for me, because I don't want people to think that all I have to do is come here. There was absolutely no danger of that. Her favorite negotiating method was to invite my wife and me to dinner. My wife adored her, and then at some point in the dinner, Golda would invite me to come to the kitchen with her, which sounded intimate enough, but then she worked me over. And I think out of this process resulted two important disengagement agreements. One along the Suez Canal, and the other in the Golden Heights, both of which, in some form, the Sinai Agreement still, it was the first step towards the peace agreement, and the Golden Agreement actually exists in its original form, and it's invoked to some extent by all the parties on the Golden Heights. So the outcome, I think, was good. The process was sometimes painful, and but I think back to Golda with affection and admiration. She came out of a period that would never have achieved what it did if it didn't believe in absolutes, and found herself in a world in which the absolutes had to be adjusted to fluctuating realities, and for the need of Israel to have a basis beyond the immediate legitimacy of its achievements. And so my recollection of Golda is warm, positive, and proud of what we achieved. And her role had to be what it was. It needed to show that what had been achieved through suffering could not just be traded away for negotiating advantages. So she attempted to get the maximum degree of permanent commitments she could get out of the negotiation. And that was the essence of our negotiation. But it involved, in the case of Syria in particular, a situation which I had to go to Damascus, where Assad, who had 3 levels of legitimacy in his system and had to meet all of them, would keep me there for hours. And the Israelis were wondering what I was giving away, because there wasn't enough to spend 5 hours of substance. And then, as soon as I landed in Israel, I was taken to the Prime Minister's office, and we'd have to go through another session of going through all the details of what was negotiated in the Golden Heights. But these are all details, and it's possible for historians to extract sentences that were said by either side in the process of it. The end result is what we set out to achieve. The purpose was to relate this process that the international environment generated to the needs of the survival of Israel, and to place Israel into a position in relation to its challenges that would most lead to the outcome that had brought Golda to Israel in the first place and had made her go through all these experiences. My role was that of Secretary of State, but Raj's history makes clear that I come from an experience that makes the future of Israel a part of my necessities.
So I think we ought to move to sort of our next leader. You know, everyone probably remembers this, but at that point in time, Israelis and Egyptians never sat down on the same table. And the only way these negotiations were carried out were with something called shuttle diplomacy. And Dr. Kissinger used to get on the plane and go back and forth. It was almost like a taxi service. But the person on the other end of this was that second leader, someone who, sadly, in many ways has really been lost to history. This is Anwar Sadat. So President Nasser dies in 1970. Remember, he had taken on the whole idea of the '67 war, which Israel won so decisively. Sadat was appointed Nasser's successor when he died, I think, of a heart attack. But most of the West knew little about him. But what was known was Sadat was seen in many ways as a risk taker, and many thought imprudently so. In 1972, one of Sadat's first acts was to expel the Soviet advisors from Egypt, even though the Soviets were the largest arms supplier to Egypt. In '73, Egypt and Syria launched the Yom Kippur War, even though Sadat had reason to believe he could not achieve his strategic aims by military means. Yet he launched a war. 2 years after '73, Henry negotiated the Sinai Interim Agreement between Egypt and Israel, which included a withdrawal of Israel's forces from the land bordering the Suez Canal. In 1977, Sadat took another very big step, something that was unheard of by any Arab leader in almost any era. He traveled to Jerusalem and he spoke to the Knesset. A year later, he and Menachem Begin came to the United States, where they signed the Camp David Peace Accords. Tragically, 3 years later, Sadat was assassinated. So, you know, Henry, it is fair to say the Camp David Accords were built upon, and Sadat thought this as well, upon your diplomatic achievements during the Yom Kippur War. By the way, that peace treaty with Egypt and Israel, a very important one, has held for 40 years. Now, Henry, you've written that the problem with Arab leadership was its clear inability or unwillingness to accept where epic poetry ends and reality begins. It appears Anwar Sadat understood the difference between those two. How would you describe Sadat as a statesman? How would you describe him as a leader? You had never met him before.
I had never met him before, and frankly, I didn't take him seriously at first. Our basic policy, at any rate, Nixon and my basic policy in the Middle East in the first term was to thwart every diplomatic move pushed by Soviet arms and by Soviet deployments, on the theory that somewhere along the line of this, some Arab country would break the uniformity of their approach, and we expressed it in the phrase, you can start wars and crises with Soviet arms, but if you want peace, you need American diplomacy. So we were waiting for some Arab leader to break this. I cannot pretend that I identified Sadat, because nobody did. In those days, he made many grandiloquent statements. In fact, the general conviction when he became president was that he wouldn't last long, that he was the weakest of the top leaders, and he had to go through much of the first year getting rid of his opponents. And in fact, when the first break came and he sent his security advisor for a separate negotiation with me, at the end of his presentation, that security advisor said, "If this works, the president will invite you to Cairo." And I wrote a note to Peter Radman, who was sitting next to me. Would it be impolite if I asked him what the second prize is? But after the war, I did accept an invitation to Cairo. And in the first conversation, Sadat said to me, "I need an American plan. I can't do this without an American plan," which was totally different from what we had heard before. And the American plan was about the issue of disengagement along the Suez Canal, which started shuttle diplomacy. And at every key point in the discussions, Sadat would say something that showed that he thought more deeply. We had an issue about how many Israeli tanks could get across the Suez Canal after disengagement. And the first Israeli offer was not distinguished by generosity. And so I brought it to the Egyptians because I did not take part in the negotiation until a deadlock developed. And the Egyptian leaders present, the military commander and the foreign minister, said they'd never signed such a document. And Sadat asked me to come to the next room. "And you won't like this," he said. "Does she mean it?" I said, "No. But you have to decide how long you want to go on with this and add numbers to see where it will go." So Sadat said, "I'll understand." We went back to the room, and he said, "I've accepted the proposal. Kissinger will try to get me more, and you two will sign it." And then Golda agreed to more. I brought it back to Egypt, and Sadat said, "Let me tell you something. I will not put any tanks across the canal because the number will not matter in the atmosphere I want to create. But you should tell Golda," that he didn't say to you, should tell the Prime Minister that this is a question also about the dignity of our people, and she has to understand that this is an aspect for me in the negotiation. So I told her that, and she wrote a very moving letter to Sadat. And my last meeting with Sadat, there were many such occasions, but I want to tell you the last meeting with Sadat. He had just been in Washington meeting his fourth American president in 6 years. So somewhat shaken, and as we flew back, and I flew back with him to New York, and in his plane, and on the plane he said, next March, the cyanide's coming back to us, and that will be a big celebration, and you should come. And then he thought for a minute and he said, no, you shouldn't come. If you come, it would be very hurtful to Jewish people. What I think we should do is that you and I should take a car to the top of Mount Sinai a month or so after the agreement is signed. And there I'm going to build a mosque, a synagogue, and a church. Well, it never came to be because he was assassinated 2 weeks later. And I don't want to say that he was a saintly person, because I've never answered fully to myself the question whether he really meant all these, or whether this was his way of gaining time for a more extreme version of the Islamic view to reappear in the world. So I cannot assure you that the degree of sincerity in the 5 years that I knew him well, I could see the evolution that I had described. And I remember him as the most thoughtful Islamic representative of that period. And the most convincing. But in foreign policy, those are the judgments you have to make. And we didn't have to make a great sacrifice because we got and the world got a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt out of it. And if there were a Sadat in the Middle East today, I would be a lot more hopeful than I am.
Okay, let's now move to the last leader, arguably the most important leader, Richard Nixon. I think for all of you, you'd be intrigued by, because you almost couldn't make up this story, how Henry Kissinger got appointed as Nixon's national security advisor in 1969. Remember, Nixon won the election in 1968. And let me just set this up a little bit for Henry, then we'll go into it. But Dr. Kissinger had never met Richard Nixon, except for a party once. He shook hands, exchanged some pleasantries. That was it. To make matters even a little more complicated, so he has never met this man who's now going to be his president-elect. Henry had been the principal foreign policy advisor for Nelson Rockefeller. Nelson Rockefeller, for over a decade, had fought with Richard Nixon. Rockefeller always wanted to be president. And the person that he counted on the most, Rockefeller, was Richard Nixon. And then all of a sudden, you get a phone call And so I'd just like you to take us through what was the meeting with Nixon about, and then what was John Mitchell's role in your hiring? And I should add one other thing. Henry won't say this, but how many other presidents today or in any other time would have hired a national security advisor, someone who had worked with an arch competitor, who they didn't know, who was going to work in the White House, where that president had decided he was going to run foreign policy out of the White House? And so the national security advisor was arguably one of the most important people to work with. And so now you're sitting in this room in the Waldorf or the Pierre.
Ironically, the invitation to call on Nixon occurred while I was having lunch with Nelson Rockefeller to discuss whether Nelson should accept an invitation to be Secretary of Defense of Nixon, which we thought was the only plausible offer that might come. And it didn't come. So the invitation to see Nixon was for me to see Nixon. Then Nixon spent 2 hours with me discussing foreign policy. Never mentioned any position. Later on, knowing him, I realized he was actually an extremely shy person and extremely reluctant to be rejected. And he did not want to be in a position to be rejected. So I left, not knowing what he wanted, other than that he wanted something. A week later, I received a call from John Mitchell that said, "Are you going to take the job or not?" And I said, "What job?" And he said, "Oh my God, he had screwed it up." So I tell you all of this to show you a side of Nixon. So this time I was called back, and I behaved with extreme irresponsibility by saying to Nixon, "I don't think I can accept this job without talking to Nelson Rockefeller, with whom I've worked for 15 years. Anyone said this to me, he would not see me again." Nixon said, "Take a few days." So I went to Rockefeller, and Rockefeller gave me an answer which no current contestant would give about his rival. Namely, has it occurred to you that Nixon is taking a much bigger chance on you than you on him? Which meant you have a duty to take this job. So that's how I got to know Nixon. And we could go on. I developed an extremely high opinion of Nixon. He was thoughtful. He was strategic. He was courageous. And he set a pattern for American foreign policy, which in its main outlines is still pursued today. And the strategic concept that he started from his first months and that we then pursued consistently over his period in office led to the breakthrough in the Middle East, to the opening to China, to creating a pattern of studying the national interest as a guide. And for this audience also, you ought to remember that when Nixon came into office, the emigration of Jews from Russia was at a level of about 700 a year. With Nixon's approval and encouragement, and it's not the approach that became the dominant one. I called on Dobrynin and said, we are not claiming we have a right to tell you your emigration, but I am telling you, we will notice what you do and our conduct will be affected by what you do. And the emigration went up from about 800 to 37,000 a year in a 4-year period. With periodic reports by the Soviets when Gromyko came to Washington. The evolution then of that debate is another matter. But this is where it was when it became a domestic issue and never went back to 37,000 again until the Soviet Union collapsed. And you should remember that Nixon did that at a time when there was no benefit. We never spoke of it. We never claimed credit for it. Even though every year the number went up by about 10,000.
So let me just go over this again. This will be an interesting part again for this Yom Kippur War period. So during the war, Nixon was dealing with 2 domestic crises at the time, which is forgotten now. The first was the forced resignation of Spiro Agnew as vice president. He had some illegal dealings, and it looked like the federal government was going to indict him. The second was the Watergate crisis. During the Yom Kippur negotiations, what we today remember as the Saturday Night Massacre, that was the firing of Archibald Cox, Elliot Richardson, and William Ruckelshaus. So if anything, during this intense period, Nixon was distracted. In essence, were you the sole decision maker about what United States policy was about United States war aims with Egypt and Israel, and how did you go about communicating with Nixon on these things?
Nixon was filled with a very complex personality. And he did not like too many meetings and conversations. But after I was appointed, he and I spent many mornings together, constantly talking about strategic objectives. So I knew his mind so well that I felt free on maybe 2 or 3 occasions to act on my own during a negotiation, and was always supported. I mean, one of the examples was when I was in China to set up Nixon's first visit, and we had developed a certain approach. And the Chinese, a standard document to which Mao rejected by saying, this sounds as if we all agreed all along, and we should put our disagreements into the document so that the agreement means something. And there were no communications, so I went along with that recommendation. And I knew that Nixon would agree with it. So it is hard that I had, of course, an important influence. But during the Yom Kippur War, I conducted most of the negotiations and much of the internal discussions. But I talked to Nixon at least an hour every morning and at least an hour every evening. And he saw everything that happened, and he approved everything that happened. So, and on the important decision of the airlift, that was his decision, because there had been a bureaucratic stalemate between the Defense Department. Really no stalemate. The Defense Department did not want to diminish its reserve supplies without additional safeguards. And Nixon said, to hell with it, and ordered an American airlift. Until then, the discussion had been about how quickly we could generate a civilian airlift through the military reserve. So I played an important role, but without Nixon's authority and without Nixon's detailed agreement, it could not have happened.
By the way, the archives show this is after the first couple of days of the war, where Israel all of a sudden found itself really in dangerous position. They had lost a tremendous amount of tanks on the northern border in the Golan. They had lost it in the southern border. Israel was in desperate need. And all of a sudden, most people actually were complacent that Israel would easily win this war. And this is what Nixon said. All destroyed Israel equipment shall be made up out of U.S. stockpiles. Whatever it takes, he said, save Israel. That wasn't made public in those days, but that's what he did. And at that point, it was probably one of the most dangerous moments in the history of Israel. I mean, Moshe Dayan went to Golda in the evening and was so alarmed, he said to Golda, "This is the end of the third temple." So you can imagine what was life like at that point.
And to understand this, you shouldn't do it entirely in terms of quotes. You should look at the daily evolution of this airlift issue. We learned about the war on Saturday. On Sunday, we started supplying high-tech equipment picked up by Israeli commercial airplanes at non-disclosed airports. In that period, we were told by Israel that they would win in 2 or 3 days. So our major concern was the resupply after it ended. On Tuesday morning, we were told that the situation was much worse than we had been led to believe. And that was the day of Agnew's resignation. So Nixon was preoccupied all that day with that constitutional issue. By the evening, when he emerged from these discussions, he authorized an assurance to Israel that we would resupply, we would replace every tank or aircraft that was lost, and that they should expend their supplies in being able to count on that promise. And we immediately ordered that 3 F-40s a day should be sent to Israel. Then on Wednesday, we began the discussion of the civilian air fleet and how we could mobilize it. And by Friday, Nixon ordered the airlift. So if you look at that sequence of events, for a country to designate its whole airlift, to promise during the war the resupply of all losses, and currently supply weapons was quite a demonstration of the determination that we had, that Israel must not lose the war. We also had the determination then to start a diplomatic phase. But first, Israel had to prevail in that war.
So let's just conclude with, you had one other big strategic concept in your mind, idea, and that's to get the Soviets out of the Middle East.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
how did this war and Sadat connect with? By the way, the Soviets worked basically just at the end of this war because of really Dr. Kissinger and Nixon and Sadat. They were really out of the Middle East, which is an amazing feat. So what was that?
Well, we thought in devising the policy that the reason the Soviets could gain this entry into the Middle East was by generating the belief that they could create a situation in which they could achieve the stated objectives of the radical countries like Egypt and Syria. And our view was that until they changed that conviction, no diplomacy could help. And this is why we opposed almost any move supported by Soviet arms, and why at the end of the 73 war, they were in effect evicted from Egypt and were sharply reduced influence in Syria. And in fact, early in the Nixon administration, I gave a background into the press in which I said our policy is to evict the Soviet Union from the Middle East. It was not a smart thing to say. And but that was the basis of our policy.
So let me just conclude with this letter, the fabulous letter. This is the letter that Golda Meir gives to Dr. Kissinger when he makes his last shuttle diplomacy, last trip to meet with Sadat to sign this interim agreement, which was so critical. And these are Golda's words. It is indeed a source of great satisfaction to me, and I sincerely hope these contacts between us through Dr. Kissinger will continue and prove to be an important turning point in our relationships. I, for my part, will do my best to establish trust and understanding between us. Both of our peoples need and preserve peace. It is my strongest conviction that peace is the goal toward which we must direct all of our energies. Let me reiterate what you said in your message. These are quotes from Sadat in his letter. When I talk of permanent peace between us, I mean it, end quote. And then Golda goes on to say, it is indeed extremely fortunate that we have Dr. Kissinger, whom we both trust, who's prepared to give us of his wisdom and talents in the cause of peace. I know that he will continue to extend this untiring service to the promotion of our common interest. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been fortunate to have Dr. Kissinger.